Hey guys. So I wanted to talk today about the fact that the first private prison in the United States opened in 1984. And since then, in just 41 years, the number of people behind bars has surged by 194%. Meanwhile, the United States population has only grown by about 36%. Odd coincidence, huh? So with the creation of for-profit prisons, the number of prisoners has soared, way above anything we'd ever seen before. So, who's benefiting from that enormous swell of imprisoned? I can tell you, it's certainly not the people imprisoned. So, we as Americans make up 4% of the world's population, but we hold nearly 20% of its prisoners, the highest incarceration rate in the world. And when disaster strikes, hurricanes, floods, wildfires, those lives, it's not uncommon for them to be treated as completely disposable. They're just locked behind in locked cells with deteriorating conditions and the knowledge and fear of the oncoming storms. Often, prisoners are used as forced labor for less than $1 a day. They're used to put sandbags out before hurricanes, or they're used after wildfires to fight fire, or during wildfires to fight fires. All sorts of things like community cleanup projects. So I don't want to just talk about the over-incarceration problem, which obviously is a big problem in America, but this video is about how little the lives of inmates are valued once inside our jails and prisons. So today we're going to speak specifically about how human beings in jails and prisons across America are being treated when disaster hits. So in Florida, there are as many as 28,000 incarcerated people jailed in mandatory evacuation zones for Hurricane Milton in 2024. But many officials just refused to evacuate their inmates anyway. They said they had it under control, it would be fine, but how could you know that in an instance of an oncoming hurricane that's supposed to be like a Cat 4 directly hitting you? I mean, hurricanes are notoriously unpredictable. Anyway, let's talk about California, where prisoners fight wildfires for pennies an hour. But when flames and smoke threaten the prisons themselves, well, those same inmates are left to choke in smoke-filled cells, just having to hope that the winds don't shift and the flames don't reach and engulf them. In Susanville and Vacayville, inmates with asthma and COPD were denied masks, which seems like a pretty easy request to accommodate, right? Well, not when the people in charge of your survival simply don't care, because that's why they were kept locked inside while all their citizens, including those of nearby towns, were ordered to evacuate. Real nice. So as I've discussed at length before on this channel, Hurricane Katrina, you should watch that video next if you want to be truly horrified. But yeah, in New Orleans, during Hurricane Katrina, guards at Orleans Parish Prison simply fled, abandoning the jail and the inmates locked inside. There were over 6,000 inmates who were left behind, with no food, no water, and no electricity, while the floodwaters just kept rising. Some stood on beds, others just screamed for help, and at least 500 people, inmates, were never accounted for again. They just vanished. Some may have drowned in locked cells or open cells, as other inmates have reported seeing bodies floating down the hallways. But the world, well, it just moved on. Next, we'll discuss Texas prisons. During Hurricane Harvey in 2017, inmates begged to be evacuated. Sadly, they weren't. Instead, they were left in prisons where sewage overflowed into their cells, floodwater quickly rose up to their knees and their waists, and there wasn't any clean drinking water or air conditioning. Food became limited, sewage was backing up and overflowing into the floodwater, flooding more and more occupied cells. Meanwhile, guards were wearing boots and gloves as, protective barriers, while prisoners were left barefoot, some sleeping on soaked, disgusting mattresses, and others on the flooded floors. Their families weren't told where they were. Some inmates went missing from records altogether, just like during Hurricane Katrina. Just poof, vanished, disappeared. And then in Texas, during the 2021 freeze, men literally froze to death in their cells. Toilets froze, pipes burst, men died of exposure, but the Department of Criminal Justice has not released an exact death toll of inmates during the deadly February freeze. And now that we've talked about the cold, let's discuss the heat. In Texas, over 2/3 of the state prisons don't have air conditioning. That's more than 70% of facilities housing tens of thousands of people. And they're trapped in cells that regularly hit 110 to 130 degrees in the summertime. Imagine trying to sleep on a metal bunk in a concrete box with no breeze, no relief, and no way out. Over the last decade, hundreds of incarcerated people have died in what experts call heat-related illness. But Texas often labels these deaths under categories like cardiac arrest or natural causes to avoid any blame or, national coverage bringing attention to the issue. And who do you think's most at risk during these heat waves in the summertime? Well, clearly it's the elderly, the disabled, those on medications, and then those unable to advocate for themselves. People who are already vulnerable are being slowly cooked alive in what human rights groups have called torture by temperature. Lawsuits have been filed. There's been multiple public protests where people have been demanding better conditions for inmates, but the state's official response? We provide fans and ice water, which many say isn't even true. So, let's get this straight. Texas will spend millions of dollars installing air conditioning in pig barns, but says it's too expensive to cool the prisons. Think about that for a second. Farm animals have more heat protection and care than human beings do. And in Mississippi state prisons, flooding disasters have occurred over multiple years, especially Parchman Farm, which is Mississippi State Penitentiary, and facilities near to that. They're built in obvious flood zones, surrounded only by farmland and swamps. So when floods hit, like in 2019, 2020, and again in 2022, entire prison units were submerged. Water poured into cells, inmates were trapped in ankle to waist deep water again, and toilets and sinks were backing up with sewage again. Inmates reported sleeping on soaked, disgusting mattresses and only having access to wet blankets and not having any access to clean drinking water for days. Having to wade through contaminated floodwater trying to reach dry areas. There was no evacuation, no electricity, and no medical attention provided. Parchman, which is already notorious for its mold, maggots, blackouts, and collapsed ceilings, well, the flooding only made things much worse, obviously. And here's the really special part. When asked for comment, state officials denied any wrongdoing and said that the prisons were handling it internally. Great. So you've got inmates drowning in sewage, men getting electrocuted in facilities with no air conditioning, no lights, and broken plumbing during some of the deadliest weather events in the South, and it barely makes the news? Got it. And remember, we're not talking about inmates that were all even convicted criminals. Some hadn't even had a trial yet, while others were children. Some were in jail for misdemeanors and minor offenses. But when disaster struck, they weren't just left behind. They were trapped in the dark, in the smoke, and in the cold, in the rising waters, sometimes contaminated with sewage, and with the knowledge that no one was coming to help them. I don't know, I guess maybe it's one thing to be simply forgotten, but it's totally another to be profited off of while dying in the dark. Across the United States, private for-profit prisons, like those run by Core Civic and GEO Group, operate hundreds of facilities, housing tens of thousands of inmates. And these companies are paid per prisoner per day, with the goal of spending as little as possible on their care. So, when disaster hits, there's no financial incentive to evacuate. There's no urgency to provide extra staff, emergency transport, or backup power. In fact, every dollar spent on inmate safety during a crisis is $1 off their bottom line. I don't even know how that's legal, but there's been multiple reports from hurricanes, floods, and heat waves showing that show private prisons failing to evacuate in time, denying medical care, and keeping prisoners in dangerous, degrading conditions as guards just flee, while the prisons themselves are still collecting government contracts. And yet these companies are rarely, if ever, investigated because, They have deep political ties, deep pockets, lobbyists, and profit protections built right into the system. So it's not just neglect, it's commodified suffering, a business model that survives on secrecy, under the assumption that no one cares what happens inside the walls of jails and prisons. Because apparently, in modern day America, it's perfectly acceptable to let inmates drown, freeze, be electrocuted, or suffocated because not a single official has ever been charged, fired, or in any way held responsible or punished. I guess these events aren't considered crimes against humanity. I don't really understand what they are considered. I mean, I guess they're not considered anything because they're not ever investigated. Human rights groups care, but elected officials certainly don't. Heads of prisons definitely don't. Owners of for-profit prisons, well, they just want to ignore it as much as possible. But yeah, I don't know. It seems so sick and like inhumane. I don't know what the right word is. Anyway, as always, thanks for watching. I'm Caroline. Let me know what you think about this issue. This is Hidden Headlines, and I will see y'all soon. Okay? Bye.